Another thing, I know you Christians all believe God is some bearded guy up in the sky. Well, I got a little something to shave God's beard with. It's called Occam's razor. Now, for those of you who don't know anything, Occam's razor basically just says, look, you don't need to come up with crazy theories to explain something perfectly normal. Let me give you an example. If I come home and the door is broken down and I see that the tables have been knocked over and a bunch of money and jewels are stolen out of my drawer and wallet, and the missus's articles of clothing are missing, well, I don't have to conclude something crazy like UFOs came down or some kind of rabid dog with supernatural powers got in and messed the whole place up. Look, I can just say clearly this is a thief who came in. That's a very simple explanation. Now, when it comes to the existence of the universe, science can explain all that. We know why there's a Big Bang. It has to do with science, not with God. So if science can tell us what it is, and that's all we need to explain what it is, then we don't need to bring in God. And if you try, I'm just like I said, I'm going to shave his beard with Occam's razor, and I just did. Occam's razor is the idea that you should not multiply hypotheses unnecessarily, which is just another way of saying you shouldn't come up with more explanations or theories than is necessary to explain a given phenomenon. What this tends to affirm in people's mind is that you should just go with the simplest answer to a given set of problems. Now, when it comes to the existence of God, applying Occam's razor usually comes in the form of saying, well, science can explain that the universe came into existence through the Big Bang, therefore we don't need to explain the existence of the universe through some sort of God. Or science can explain why there are diseases or bad weather, why people murder each other. Psychology can explain that. Therefore, we don't need religion coming up with this complicated theory of the soul. Now, the first thing I'll say about this is that when it comes to religion, the accusation of Occam's razor just begs the question, which is a technical fallacy that logicians have classified as assuming as a given the very thing you have to prove. Because even when it comes to something like the Big Bang, saying that science has explained that the Big Bang was the cause of the universe doesn't actually explain the existence of the universe, because it doesn't explain the fundamental question of why there is something rather than nothing. In other words, it doesn't explain why there was a Big Bang to begin with. So interestingly, that kind of argument from atheists would seem to be the very opposite of Occam's razor, because it doesn't take the simplest explanation, which is to say that the Big Bang, which was a cause of the universe, had itself to have been caused, and therefore was the effect of that prior cause, which would be God. And to believe that the Big Bang didn't have a prior cause towards which it was the effect would be to deny causality, which is repugnant to all forms of science, not only physics but also chemistry and biology, and the scientific method itself generally, universally, we could say, presupposes the validity of causality. So it doesn't seem a simple explanation to apply Occam's razor to the question of the universe's existence. Another thing that could be said about Occam's razor is that frequently that method is just wrong, that truth and reality turn out to be counterintuitive or mysterious, almost like you would find something in a detective novel, like it's not the kind of explanation you would first come up with. You think of a good detective novel versus a bad one. In a bad one, it'll be obvious at the outset who the killer was. In a good one, it won't be very clear, and the universe is often very much like that. The explanations aren't obvious and apparent right away. There has to be a lot of digging and questioning, often over centuries, to arrive at even a feasible opinion about anything. One good example would be, if you looked at the human body, you see that we have two hands, one on each side of your body, two arms, one also on each side of your body, two legs, two eyes, two ears, two nostrils. You would seem to draw the conclusion that when it came to, say, the heart, you would have one on both sides of your body. That would seem to be the simplest explanation that would accord with the general pattern you had seen. But in fact, this is completely wrong. So that would be a case where the simplest explanation is obviously the false one. Or when people think of the Earth or planets or stars, they tend to think they're circular. Well, in fact, they're not. Their shape is slightly different. So the idea that the simplest answer, which is what Occam's razor is appealing to, is more likely to yield the truer answer, simply assumes as a given what it has to prove to be true, and in many cases has been shown to be false. So when it comes to God, it can't be applied until God is actually disproven. And since we don't believe God can be disproven, or we believe we do have good proofs for the existence of God, Occam's razor doesn't apply at all. The other reason why an appeal to Occam's razor when it comes to saying that positing the existence of God is just a superfluous hypothesis to explain the existence of the universe, an additional reason why that is a false accusation is because if Occam's razor is about coming up with the simplest explanation or the least amount of hypotheses to explain a given phenomenon, then when it comes to God, that question will actually determine the nature of the universe itself. In other words, the phenomenon which we're coming up with hypotheses to evaluate will itself be determined by whether God exists or does not exist at the outset. In other words, we will not be able to tell what the simplest explanation or hypothesis is or how many are necessary at the very beginning, because to do so would presuppose that we already understand the phenomenon we're talking about. But if the question is whether God created the universe or not, then the phenomenon we're talking about is the universe. And if the question is, did God create it? Then the nature of that phenomenon will depend on the answer to that question. So in other words, hypotheses about that phenomenon, namely the universe, will have to be based on whether we have already decided if God exists or not. Otherwise, we will not be able to understand what would be the simplest explanation for that phenomenon, because we just won't understand the way to approach it at the outset.